Claude responded, I raised my best friend's grandson for 15 years, and the day he graduated from the police academy, his real father walked in wearing a $5,000. I raised my best friend's grandson for 15 years, and the day he graduated from the police academy, his real father walked in wearing a $5,000 suit and handed him a set of keys to a downtown condo. You've earned your place in this family, he said. My grandson took the keys. Then he looked over at me, and I still don't know what he was thinking in that moment. I was standing near the back of the auditorium in Tulsa, holding a card with $200 folded inside, the most I could spare after the truck needed new brakes. My back had been giving me trouble all week, and the folding chair wasn't helping. None of that mattered until I saw the man in the suit walk through the side doors like he owned the building. That's where the story ends up. But it starts almost 16 years earlier, on a July afternoon at a gas station off Route 66 outside of Tulsa. I was 58 then, retired from the fire department for 2 years, and still restless about it. I'd stop for gas and a cup of coffee, the same routine I ran most mornings just to have somewhere to be. That's when I noticed the boy sitting on the curb by the air pump, maybe 4 years old, wearing a t-shirt 3 sizes too big and no shoes. He wasn't crying. He was just sitting there, watching cars pull in and out like he was waiting for one of them to stop for him specifically. I asked the cashier if she knew the kid. She said his mother had gone inside 20 minutes ago to use the bathroom and never came back out. She checked the bathroom was empty, the back door unlocked. I called the police. Then I sat down on the curb next to the boy because I didn't know what else to do with myself. You hungry? I asked. He looked at me sideways. I'm not supposed to talk to strangers. Good. That's a smart rule. I'll be a stranger with a granola bar, and you don't have to talk, you just have to eat it. He took the granola bar. He didn't say another word until the officer arrived, and even then he only answered in nods. His name was Caleb. His mother, I learned later, was my late daughter's college roommate, a woman named Denise, who I'd met exactly twice, at graduations a lifetime ago. My daughter had died of an aneurysm 9 years before that. No warning, no goodbye, just gone on a Tuesday afternoon while she was grading papers. I never had grandchildren of my own. I never expected to. But when the caseworker mentioned Denise's name, and I realized I was the only adult in 3 counties who had any connection to this boy at all, something in me sat up straight. It took 11 months. Background checks, home inspections, a parenting class I attended alongside people 40 years younger than me who probably assumed I was somebody's father come to pick them up. But eventually, Caleb came to live in my house on Maple Ridge Road, carrying a plastic grocery bag with everything he owned inside it. He stood in my living room and looked around like he was calculating exits. How long do I stay here? However long you want. Longer if I have anything to say about it. He didn't trust that answer, and I didn't blame him. For the first few months, he hid crackers in his sock drawer. He slept with his sneakers on. He flinched when I raised my voice to call him in for dinner, and it took me a long time to understand that flinch wasn't about me. It was about every adult who'd raised their voice before me and meant something worse by it. One night, he knocked over a jar of pickles reaching for a cup. It shattered across the kitchen floor, and Caleb went rigid, both arms pinned to his sides, waiting. I got the broom. It's a jar, buddy. We've got more jars. He stared at me. That's it? What else is there supposed to be? His chin started shaking, and then he cried on my kitchen floor harder than I'd ever seen a kid cry, and I just sat down next to him and let him get through it. The adoption went final a year and a half later. Outside the courthouse, he grabbed my hand and asked if this meant nobody could move him again. Not unless you plan on shipping me off to a nursing home first. He laughed, really laughed, for maybe the first time since I'd known him, and called me Grandpa Ray for the rest of his life after that. What I didn't know back then, what I wouldn't find out for 15 years, was that Denise hadn't vanished into thin air. She'd gone back to a man named Preston Cole, Caleb's biological father. A man she'd been terrified of for reasons that would only come out much later. And Preston Cole knew exactly where his son had ended up. He knew the address on Maple Ridge Road. He knew which elementary school. He knew about the year I picked up part-time security work at the mall just to cover Caleb's asthma medication. For 15 years, that man watched from a distance and never once knocked on the door. I built a life with that boy piece by piece, the way you build anything worth having, not in one grand gesture, but in 1,000 small ones nobody's keeping score of. When Caleb was 9, I found a beat-up 10-speed bike at an estate sale for $8, rust creeping up the frame, one pedal missing entirely. He stood next to it in the driveway like I'd lost my mind. You paid money for that? I prefer to call it an investment. In garbage? We spent 2 weekends taking it apart on the back porch, sanding the rust off, replacing the pedal with one I found at the hardware store. The first time he rode it down Maple Ridge without training wheels, he made it about 30 feet before going straight into Mrs. Delgado's rose bushes. I hurried over. He held up a hand before I could say a word. Don't. I've got it. He pulled the bike upright himself, climbed back on with a thorn scratch bleeding down his forearm, and tried again. That was Caleb. He'd let you patch him up eventually, but only after he'd proven to himself he could survive the fall alone first. At 13, he got suspended for shoving a kid into a locker. The vice principal called me at home. When I got there, Caleb was sitting outside the office with his knuckles split and his jaw set like concrete. He said I was a charity case. Caleb told me on the drive home. Said you probably get paid to keep me. I wanted to tell him I understood exactly why he swung. Instead, I said, you're apologizing to him tomorrow. He started it. He used words. You used your fists. Which one of you is standing here in trouble? So I just take it? Let people say whatever they want about where I came from? No. You walk away, or you report it, or you use your own words right back at him. You don't get to hit somebody just because they found the one thing that hurts. He didn't speak to me the rest of the ride. I stopped at the Waffle House anyway. He stared at the sign like he couldn't believe it. Thought I was grounded. You are. Grounded kids still get waffles. Over hash browns, I told him he didn't have to be ashamed of where he'd started, but he didn't get to use it as a license to be cruel to people either. He pushed his fork around his plate and said, I hate when you make sense. He apologized to the kid the next morning. Didn't mean every word of it, but he said them. By high school, Caleb had turned into the kind of student the coaches remembered. Not because he was the most talented kid on the field, but because he was the first one at practice and the last one to leave, running extra sprints nobody assigned him. He decided in his junior year that he wanted to go into law enforcement, and I never once tried to talk him out of it, even though every siren I heard after that made something in my chest go tight. When he passed his physical fitness exam for the police academy application, he came home and slapped the acceptance letter against my chest without a word. I read it twice standing in the kitchen. You sure about this? I asked. Made up my mind in 9th grade, old man. The academy covered tuition, but not the equipment, not the housing during the training months, not the fees nobody puts in the brochure. I told him we'd figure it out. He told me not to do anything stupid. So naturally, I sold my boat. It wasn't much, an old base boat with a motor that needed convincing on cold mornings. My late wife and I used to take it out to Grand Lake before she passed. I kept it in the side yard under a tarp for years afterward, telling myself I'd get back out there someday. A man from Broken Arrow gave me $3,200 for it and hauled it away on a Saturday morning. Caleb noticed the empty spot in the yard the next time he came home. Where's the boat? Sold it. His face changed. Why? That thing barely ran. You needed the deposit for housing. Grandpa, that was yours and Grandma's. That stopped me for a second. He rarely brought her up like that. He'd never met her, but he knew every story I'd ever told him about her. I know, I said. You don't have to keep score of what I give up. I'm not asking you to give anything up. You're not taking it. I'm choosing where it goes. He looked away and wiped his face with the back of his hand. One day I'm buying you a better one. I'll settle for you calling your grandfather more than once a week. He threw a dish towel at me and didn't speak for an hour, which was as close to a hug as Caleb got most days. The academy changed him the way it changes most young men, made him quieter, more careful with his words, more aware of his own body. It also put a stopwatch on my own decline, though I didn't tell him that. My knees had been complaining for years, but that spring my hip joined the argument, and I started forgetting small things where I'd set my glasses, whether I'd taken my blood pressure pills that morning. Nothing serious, I told myself. Just age catching up to a man who used to run into burning buildings for a living. I didn't tell Caleb how much pain I was in most days. He was buried in training, working toward his certification in emergency response tactics, which felt like its own private joke given how many nights he'd called to check on me. You take your pills today? He asked once, over the phone. Every one of them. Which ones? The little white ones and the big yellow ones. I've got a system, Caleb. There was a pause on the line. You'd tell me if something was wrong, right? Of course I would. That answer came out too fast, and we both knew it. By graduation morning, I'd convinced myself I was managing fine. I drove to Oklahoma City in my old Chevy wearing the same gray suit I'd worn to Caleb's adoption hearing all those years ago. In my jacket pocket sat a card with $200 folded inside and a note that said, "For whatever's next." I parked farther from the academy building than I should have, and I stopped twice on the walk-in to let my hips settle. When Caleb crossed the stage in his dress uniform, I stood up before anyone else in my row. "That's my grandson," I told the woman beside me. "I can tell," she said, smiling at the way my voice cracked on the word grandson. After the ceremony, families gathered in the courtyard outside for a small reception. A department official announced that a special guest wanted to say a few words about one of the graduates before the ceremony officially closed. Then Preston Cole walked through the side doors. He wore a suit that fit him the way suits only fit men who buy a new one every season, and he had two people trailing behind him carrying a leather portfolio and a garment bag. Outside, in the parking lot, a black Cadillac Escalade waited with a bow tied across the grille. I recognized the name the second the official said it. Cole Energy Partners had its name on half the drilling operations in the state. Preston Cole had the kind of unhurried, expensive walk that made everyone around him unconsciously straighten their posture. He stepped up to the microphone and spoke for a minute about discipline and public service in the honor of watching a young man rise to this moment. Then his voice shifted. "There's another reason this young man matters to me," he said. Caleb went still. "I am his biological father." Nobody cheered. The only sound was the wind moving through the flags along the courtyard fence. I looked at Caleb, expecting shock. I didn't find any. That scared me worse than the announcement itself. One of Preston's assistants stepped forward with the key fob to the Escalade, and past the glass doors I could see the vehicle itself, black and gleaming, ribbon fluttering slightly in the breeze. "You've spent your whole life proving what kind of man you are," Preston said, holding the key out. "You've earned your place in this family." Caleb reached out and took it. My fingers tightened around the card in my pocket. Then Preston produced a manila folder, holding it out with both hands like he was presenting a diploma. "One small formality," he said, "before we head out to celebrate properly." A man behind him uncapped a pen and offered it to Caleb. That gesture, the pen already uncapped, already waiting, bothered me more than anything else that had happened so far. Caleb took the folder, but not the pen. "What exactly is this?" Preston smiled, patient. "A reconciliation agreement. It protects everyone's privacy going forward." "Protects it from what?" "The press, attorneys, people who might try to take advantage of this reunion." The way he said people made it clear he'd already sorted the whole courtyard into useful and inconvenient categories. He turned to address the small crowd. "Caleb will have every opportunity he should have had from day one." Then he started listing them: a condo downtown, a security consulting position with Cole Energy, access to the family ranch outside Ponca City, a transition allowance for whatever he needed while he adjusted to his new life. New life. Those two words hit harder than anything else he'd said. I looked around the courtyard. Families stood near the refreshment table holding paper cups of lemonade, watching in the kind of silence that isn't peaceful. Through the glass doors, the Escalade sat under the afternoon sun like a promise somebody was trying to buy. Caleb opened the folder. Preston kept talking. "Of course, no pressure to change your name. That's entirely your call. But if you wanted to reconnect with the Cole family publicly, we would support that fully." My hand found the card in my jacket, $200, for whatever's next. In that moment, it felt almost like an insult, though I knew it wasn't meant as one. I looked down at my shoes, polished the night before, cracked at the toe anyway. Across from me, one of Preston's assistants wore shoes that probably cost more than my monthly pension check. I hated myself a little for noticing that. Worse, I hated the thought that followed it. Maybe this was what Caleb deserved. Not the old Chevy with a check engine light that never turned off. Not my two-bedroom house with the gutter that needed replacing. Not a grandfather who kept a list taped to the refrigerator because his memory wasn't as reliable as it used to be. Maybe love sometimes meant stepping back so somebody could give your kid more than you ever could. Then another part of me rose up and wanted Caleb to hand that key straight back and tell this man exactly where he could put his condo. But that was my pride talking, not my love for him. The truth was harder. If Caleb wanted that life, I had to let him choose it without making him feel guilty for walking toward it. I loosened my grip on the card. Caleb turned one page of the folder, then another. "You've read all of this?" "Of course," Preston said. "Every section?" "My legal team drafted it." That's not what I asked. The courtyard went quieter. Preston's smile thinned slightly. Yes, I've reviewed it. Caleb kept reading. I was too far away to make out the text, but I could see yellow tabs marking pages, signature lines waiting. The man with the pen took a small step closer. Take your time, he said, which was a strange thing to offer while holding a pen an inch from someone's hand. Caleb pointed to a paragraph. This says I acknowledge you made reasonable efforts to find and support me. Preston's expression didn't move. Standard language. Is it true? We never stopped thinking about you. That's not what I asked. A few phones lowered. This had stopped feeling like a celebration and started feeling like something else entirely. Preston folded his hands. I was in a difficult position, Caleb. Your mother and I, there were things happening back then you don't understand. Then explain them. Preston glanced at his attorney before answering. There were threats, business rivals who would have used a custody situation to destroy everything I'd built. I made a decision I believed protected you. How long have you known where I was? A pause. I always hoped you were safe. How long? I received occasional updates. Caleb nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer and hated hearing it anyway. Was that before or after my asthma diagnosis? The question was too specific to be a guess. Preston's eyes cut toward his attorney for half a second, and that was the moment I understood Caleb had walked into this courtyard already knowing more than I did. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded page. What's that? Preston asked. Caleb opened it. A report from a private investigator, dated 11 years earlier. The color drained slightly from Preston's face. Caleb read from it. Subject resides with guardian Raymond Hutchins in Tulsa. Attends Riverside Elementary. Guardian has taken additional part-time employment, likely related to medical expenses for the child's asthma treatment. My name sounded strange coming out of his mouth in that context. I remembered that year clearly: the inhaler prescriptions, the ER visit that scared 10 years off my life, the extra shifts at the mall security desk that I told Caleb were just because I was bored in retirement. Somebody had been watching us the whole time. Somebody had written it down and filed it away. I hired people because I needed to know you were safe, Preston said. You knew about my asthma. That's not the same as understanding the whole situation. You knew Grandpa Ray picked up extra work. I was advised not to interfere. By who? My attorneys. Caleb's voice stayed level. Did they advise you not to send a birthday card either? Nobody moved. I wanted to step forward, but something held me back. This was Caleb's moment to ask, not mine. Preston's voice dropped. I know how this looks. It doesn't just look terrible. It is terrible. A university official, no, an academy official, hovering near the edge of the crowd, started drifting toward the microphone, probably hoping to end things gracefully. Caleb held up a hand. I'm almost done. He turned slightly toward the small crowd gathered around him. 3 weeks ago, an attorney named Rosa Ibarra contacted me. A woman near the front stood up. Plain suit, no assistants, no entourage, just a leather folder under one arm. Preston's face went rigid. You had no right to reach out to him before the estate review concluded, Preston said. Rosa's expression didn't shift. I represent the independent trustee. We were legally obligated to notify him. Caleb looked back at me, and for a second his face softened, like he could see how lost I was. Then he explained it plainly. Preston's father, Caleb's biological grandfather, had died 8 months earlier, and his trust required identification of all legally verified biological descendants. During that process, old records led investigators to Caleb. A DNA comparison confirmed what the private investigator's file had only implied years before. Caleb was Preston Cole's son, and he was entitled to a share of the family trust whether Preston wanted that or not. He doesn't have to move anywhere, Rosa said. He doesn't have to take a job with your company. He doesn't have to sign away his right to talk honestly about his own childhood. Preston's attorney stepped in. This isn't the venue for legal interpretation. Rosa didn't look at him. Then maybe it shouldn't have been staged at a police academy graduation. The folder in Caleb's hands looked different suddenly. Not a welcome home gift. A leash with a bow on it. You knew about all this? I asked him. He nodded. For 3 weeks. Why didn't you tell me? His eyes met mine. Because I needed to understand why he was really here. That answer hurt more than I expected. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he'd carried it alone. Preston stepped toward him. Caleb, we can talk about this privately. You're being pulled in a dozen directions by people with their own agendas. Caleb looked down at the key in his palm, then closed his hand around it. "Thank you," he said. "I'll keep the car." Preston's shoulders relaxed, a small, triumphant smile creeping back onto his face. Mine, I imagine, disappeared entirely. Then Caleb turned toward Rosa. "I'd like her to explain what you actually expected in return." Rosa stepped forward without hurrying, calm as a woman confirming a bank balance while everyone else in that courtyard looked like they were watching a car accident in slow motion. "For the record," she said, "I represent the independent trustee overseeing the estate of Caleb's paternal grandfather. I do not represent Preston Cole, Cole Energy Partners, or this academy." Preston's attorney tried again. "This is a private family matter." "Then it probably shouldn't have happened in front of 200 people, Rosa said. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd, and even Caleb looked down to hide a small smile. Rosa opened her folder. "Caleb Hutchins has been legally confirmed as a biological grandchild and beneficiary under the trust. That status has nothing to do with where he lives, what name he carries, or whether he accepts employment from this family." "No one said otherwise," Preston said. Rosa turned a page. "The agreement your legal team drafted says otherwise in at least 4 places." She read through it plainly, a clause requiring Caleb to state that Preston had made reasonable efforts to find and support him, a clause barring him from discussing his childhood or the investigation reports publicly, a broad release of claims, and language granting a Cole family communications team authority over any interviews or public statements he might ever make about his own life. "This is exactly why private matters should stay private," Preston said, glancing at the small news crew that had shown up for the graduation itself and stayed for this instead. "What context?" Caleb said quietly. "Makes a lie true?" "Caleb, please." "No. You brought the cameras. They were already here for the ceremony. You arranged for them to stay." Preston didn't answer that. His composure cracked slightly at the edges. "I was trying to protect you from exactly this kind of spectacle. You created the spectacle." Another uncomfortable laugh moved through the crowd. Preston's eyes flashed, then he caught himself and softened his voice. "You only know pieces of what happened. Then help me understand the rest." "I was 26. My father threatened to disinherit me completely if I stayed with your mother. He never believed you were mine. There were threats about the business, about custody, about things I couldn't survive publicly at the time. Then why didn't you fight for me later? When you had money, when you had lawyers, when none of that mattered anymore?" Preston's jaw tightened. "I was scared." "I can understand being scared once," Caleb said. "You had 15 years. The courtyard went silent. Preston glanced toward me, as if I might rescue him from this conversation. I almost laughed out loud at that. Instead, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since Caleb pulled out that folded page. "Did your lawyers tell you not to send him a birthday card too? 15 years worth?" Preston looked at me properly for the first time that day, not as an old man standing near the wall, but as the person who'd actually been there while he watched from a distance. "I was told contact could destabilize his placement," he said quietly. "For 15 years? He looked away. Caleb took a breath. "You keep saying you watched because you cared, but watching isn't raising somebody." He pointed toward me without turning his head. He didn't watch. He showed up. Preston's eyes moved to me again. "He sat with me every night. I couldn't breathe right when my asthma flared up," Caleb continued. "He learned every emergency response protocol before I did just so he could quiz me on it. He worked a second job at 59 years old and told me he was bored in retirement. He sold the one thing he had left from his marriage so I could afford housing during the academy." My throat tightened. "Caleb," I said quietly. He shook his head. "You never once told me I had to become something to make any of that worth it." Then he turned back to Preston. "You didn't come back because I became your son again. You came back because a DNA test made me valuable to your family's paperwork." Preston's eyes filled, but his voice stayed sharp. "That isn't fair." "No," Caleb said, "it isn't." He opened his hand. The key sat in his palm, catching the light. For a moment I thought he might hand it back. Instead, he held it up. "You said this car came with no conditions." Preston hesitated. "Yes." "Good. I'm holding you to that." Confusion moved across Preston's face. Caleb looked toward Rosa. "Can that be transferred directly to the Tulsa Foster Youth Foundation?" "Once the title clears, yes," Rosa said. Preston stepped forward. "What are you talking about?" "They'll auction it," Caleb said. "The money can go toward emergency housing, laptops, transportation, and college deposits for kids aging out of the system. You'd give away an $80,000 vehicle just to humiliate me? This was never about humiliating you, Caleb said, looking at the key one last time. It's for kids whose fathers know exactly where they are and still don't show up. Nobody clapped right away. That silence made it feel more real than applause would have. Then an older man near the front started, and a few academy instructors joined him. And within a few seconds, most of the courtyard was on its feet. I barely registered it. I was watching Preston Cole's composure finally break all the way open. "You're destroying the only chance we have at being a family," he said. Caleb set the unsigned folder down on a nearby table. "No, I'm refusing to pretend we already were one." Preston left before the applause died down. His attorney gathered the paperwork. His assistants trailed after him, one of them muttering something to Rosa about how any transfer of that vehicle would be reviewed carefully. Rosa handed him a business card without breaking stride. "I'm sure it will." Outside, the Escalade still sat by the curb, ribbon fluttering. A few cadets gathered around it, but nobody touching it. Caleb and I walked past it together, him still in his dress uniform, me still carrying that folded card in my pocket. Neither of us said much until we reached the parking lot. "You okay?" I asked. He laughed once, no humor in it. "I just found out a man worth 9 figures had people watching us for 15 years. Still working out how I feel about that." We got in the truck. It coughed twice before turning over, same as always. For the first 10 minutes, we drove without talking, cadets waving caps out of car windows around us like it was any other graduation day. Finally, I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked out the window. "I told you." I needed to know what he actually wanted first. "That's not what I asked." He turned toward me. "What was I supposed to do? Call you the night Rosa reached out and say, 'Hey, Grandpa, my biological father is worth a fortune and I might inherit a piece of it'? You'd have driven to Oklahoma City before I finished the sentence. Probably. You'd have tried to fix it for me. I'm your grandfather. That's the job. I'm 24. We sat at a red light. He took off his cap and set it on the dashboard. "I was trying to protect you. I don't need protecting from your own life, Caleb. You hide how bad your hip's gotten from me. That's different." "How?" "Because it is." He gave me a tired look, and that's when the argument turned real. "You still think everything hard belongs on your shoulders," he said, "even when nobody asked you to carry it. That's what raising somebody means." "No, that's what you do. It's not the only way." The light turned green. I pulled forward slower than I needed to. "I saw you take that key," I said. "For a second, I thought you were going with him." His head snapped toward me. "You thought I'd leave with him?" I didn't know what to think. After everything, it wasn't about trust. It was about me. I exhaled hard, hating what came next. I'm 62 years old. My hip barely got me across that courtyard. Half the time, you're the one reminding me to take my pills. Then a man shows up with a downtown condo and a ranch and connections and everything I never could give you. And for one ugly second, I thought maybe you'd look at his life and realize you'd settled for mine. Caleb didn't answer right away. We merged onto the highway, the city thinning out behind us. Finally, he said, "You're not competing with him." Didn't feel that way standing in that courtyard. "He's competing with 15 years he can't get back." He looked over at me. "And he's losing because you were there." Something heavy went out of me and something heavier settled in its place. At a rest stop outside Stroud, I pulled over. "What are we doing?" he asked. "My hip needs 5 minutes." That wasn't the whole truth. I reached into my jacket and handed him the card. He frowned. "What's this?" "Your graduation gift, Grandpa." "Open it." He slid the money out, then unfolded the note. "For whatever's next." His mouth tightened. $200? I know it isn't much. He looked at me like I'd said something foolish. "This is the first thing anybody's given me today without expecting something back for it." I looked away. He reached over and put his hand on my shoulder, and we sat there in that gravel lot until my hip stopped complaining enough to drive. For 2 days, I thought the worst of it was over. Then a cadet's phone video of the whole scene hit the internet, and by that weekend, local news had it, and by the following week, it had gone national. The foster kid who turned down his oil money father at his own police academy graduation. Some people praised Caleb. Others called him ungrateful, said I'd poisoned him against his real family. I read that particular comment more times than I should have. Preston released a statement claiming he'd attempted a private reconciliation and been ambushed by opportunists. His lawyers challenged the validity of the trust claim, demanded additional DNA testing, questioned old records, dragged everything out for months. The Escalade sat in legal limbo. Caleb postponed his start date at the department twice, buried in depositions and paperwork instead of patrol training. You can walk away from this, I told him one night, finding him at my kitchen table surrounded by documents. That's what he wants. You don't need the money. It was never about needing it. He set down his pen. If I walk away now, he gets to decide that making it difficult enough was the same as erasing me twice. I understood then that Caleb wasn't fighting for money. He was fighting for the plain right to not disappear just because someone powerful found him inconvenient. Preston had his own reckoning coming. An internal review at Coal Energy found that some of the investigators tracking Caleb over the years had been paid through the company under a line item labeled security consulting. Preston stepped back from daily operations while the board looked into it. He didn't lose everything overnight. Real life rarely works that clean, but for the first time, the control he'd always taken for granted started slipping through his fingers. 7 months after graduation, Rosa called while Caleb and I were eating chili at my kitchen table. The trustee approved the claim, she said through the speakerphone. Fully. Caleb closed his eyes. I put my hand on his shoulder. One more thing, Rosa added. Preston's requested a private meeting before the final paperwork is signed. With lawyers? Caleb asked. No. Cameras? Publicists? No. He says he wants to come alone. 6 months earlier, I'd have laughed at the idea of Preston Cole showing up anywhere without an entourage. Caleb picked the place, a small diner off the interstate called the Copper Kettle, the kind of spot where truckers still stop for coffee before sunrise, and the booths have gone soft with 40 years of elbows. Preston arrived early. I almost didn't recognize him. No suit, just jeans and a plain jacket, no security anywhere in sight. He looked older, not from wrinkles, but from something heavier sitting behind his eyes. He spotted us and walked over slowly. Thank you for coming, he said. Caleb nodded toward the empty side of the booth. Preston sat down. The waitress poured coffee for all three of us, completely unaware she was interrupting one of the strangest reunions in the state. For almost a full minute, nobody said anything. Then Preston wrapped both hands around his mug. I've rehearsed this conversation more times than I can count. And every version sounded like I was defending myself instead of telling the truth. Caleb didn't answer. Preston looked at him directly. I spent 15 years telling myself a story, that I left because I had no choice. There was truth buried in that, but not enough of it. He took a slow breath. My father hated your mother the moment he suspected you weren't going to be raised the way he wanted a Cole raised. He threatened to cut me off from everything, the company, the family name, all of it. I told myself I'd come back once things settled. But you didn't. No. Why? Preston closed his eyes briefly. Because every year it got harder to face what I'd have to explain. Silence sat over the table. I got reports on you. At first I only wanted to know you were alive. Then I learned you'd been placed with Raymond. He glanced at me. I told myself you were finally safe, and that made it easier to stay away. That made leaving easier, Caleb repeated. Yes. He didn't try to soften it. That was the lie I told myself until I believed it. When I saw reports about your asthma, about Raymond picking up extra shifts, I convinced myself that showing up would only confuse you more. He looked at me. The truth is I wasn't protecting Caleb. I was protecting myself from what I'd see if I looked directly at what I'd done. Nobody spoke for a moment. I was terrified, Preston said quietly. Of what? Caleb asked. Of seeing the damage. The waitress brought food that nobody touched. Preston looked at Caleb again. The day my father died and the trust review started, I wasn't thinking about you needing a father. I was thinking about secrets getting dragged into daylight. He gave a short, bitter laugh. My first thought wasn't that I might finally get to know my son. My first thought was whether the company's board would find out what kind of man I'd actually been. So I tried to control everything, the car, the agreement, the press, all of it. He met Caleb's eyes. I didn't come back because you needed a father. I came back because I needed control of the story. A tear slid down his face. I'm sorry. That's all I've got. No excuses left. Caleb watched him for a long moment. I believe you're sorry, he finally said. But believing you're sorry isn't the same as pretending none of it happened. The hope in Preston's face faded into something quieter. I know. If we're going to have any kind of relationship going forward, there are rules, Caleb said. Preston nodded immediately. Anything. You don't show up at Grandpa Ray's house without calling first. I won't. You don't send gifts hoping they'll erase anything. I understand. You don't ever call him my guardian like it's a lesser word than father. Preston glanced at me, then back at Caleb. I won't. And you never ever tell anyone that you raised me. Preston's eyes filled again. I won't. If you lie about any of this again, even once, we're finished. Permanently. Preston didn't hesitate. I accept that. The conversation went on another hour. Not because everything had been solved, but because for the first time nobody in that booth was trying to win anything. Preston asked about the academy. Caleb answered plainly. Preston asked about my hip. I told him it still complained louder than I did most mornings. And something in his face actually softened at that, human for a second, no performance in it. When we stood to leave, Preston reached into his jacket, and I felt my whole body tighten out of old habit. He noticed. Not a gift, he said quietly. He set a folded slip of paper on the table, his personal cell number, no assistant, no publicist attached to it. If either of you ever wants to talk, you call me directly. Caleb picked it up. He didn't promise anything. Neither did I. Sometimes that's exactly what forgiveness looks like. Not an embrace, not tears, just one door left unlocked in case anyone ever wants to walk through it. The trust finalized a month later. Caleb received exactly what the law said belonged to him. He didn't move to the ranch outside Ponca City. He didn't take the security position at Coal Energy. He reported to the department and finished his field training like he'd planned all along. The Escalade was transferred, auctioned, and turned into scholarships and housing grants for kids aging out of foster care across 3 counties. Caleb paid off the last of my mortgage without asking. I argued about it for 3 straight days. I don't need you covering my bills. You didn't raise me, so I'd owe you money, he said. You raised me so I'd know how to take care of people. This is just me practicing. I didn't have a good answer for that. One spring morning, almost a year after graduation, Caleb drove me out to Grand Lake. There was a used aluminum boat tied up at the dock. Nothing fancy, just about the right size for 2 people and not much luck with the fish. He tossed me the keys. You kept your promise, I said. No, he said, grinning. You kept yours. We spent the whole afternoon out there catching almost nothing, and it was about as close to perfect as a day gets. Before we drove home, Caleb asked me to take one picture, not by the boat, not by the lake, but standing next to my old Chevy with the check engine light still glowing on the dash. Smile, old man, he said. I did. That photo sits on my mantle to this day. People sometimes ask why there's no picture of the Escalade or the ranch or the day Caleb came into more money than either of us ever imagined. The answer is simple. Those things changed his future. That old truck reminds us both who actually drove him there. Getting older has taught me something I wish I'd understood decades sooner. Most men my age aren't afraid of the aches or the failing memory or the shrinking pension check. We're afraid of becoming unnecessary, of waking up one morning and finding out the people we spent our lives loving have quietly moved on past us. Caleb taught me otherwise. If you raise someone with patience and honesty and love that doesn't come with conditions, they may eventually stop needing you to fix every single thing in their life. But they will never stop knowing exactly where home is. Blood can explain where a person starts out. It can't explain who actually stayed. Preston gave Caleb life. I was lucky enough to be the one who got to share the rest of it with him. If somebody in your life proved that family gets built through love and not through blood, I'd love to hear their story in the comments below. Sometimes those stories are exactly the reminder we all need. Claude responded, showing up is the whole job, not the size of the check you can leave behind, not the car in the driveway. Just being there on the ordinary Tuesday, nobody's key. Showing up is the whole job, not the size of the check you can leave behind, not the car in the driveway. Just being there on the ordinary Tuesday nobody's keeping track of. A granola bar on a curb, a rusted bike fixed on a back porch, hands that shake taking pills every morning so you can keep going one more year for someone. That's what turns a stranger into family, and no amount of money can buy its way into that seat at the table.